I'd like to welcome Raj Mody, who's a partner and head of the Pensions Consulting Group at PwC, and also Paul Mulhern. He's an independent trustee with Capital Cranfield and has over 25 years' experience advising and supporting trustees and sponsors. I'm Frank Johnson. I work for RPMI and I'm a member of the NAPF DB Council. So I think just before we start, as Raj walks over to the podium, it would be interesting just to get a feel for how many of you are trustees as opposed to sponsors, consultants, or managers. I would, for the benefit of those on the web stream, that's probably half the room are sort of trustees, so thank you for that. Raj.
Frank, thank you for that, and good morning, everyone. It seems to be customary to start presentations by saying how pleased you are to be here. All of the speakers yesterday started with that, and let me say the same. I'm pleased to be here, but I mean it in a very specific way. I'm pleased to be here in this room, right on this stage, because it's a bit like the NAPF saying, we know, Raj and Paul, you're only a breakout work stream, but you're probably going to be good enough to be a plenary session, so have the room. It's on us, and let's hope that we live up to that vote of confidence. But good morning, and it is a pleasure to be here, and good morning to the 6 million people on the web stream as well. We're pleased you could join us too. This is a presentation fundamentally about serendipity, about the way that chance encounters can lead to a force for good, can lead to positive outcomes. I met my wife, or the woman who is now my wife, through very serendipitous circumstances, and that's working out well. So I'm a big believer in serendipity. It's also a presentation about technology and innovation, and this has been, in fact, the theme running throughout the conference, from Jimmy Wales talking about the power of platforms and of mass usage and what you can do with that, from Manny Norman talking about machines versus humans. It's a concurrent theme, and we will be coming back to that theme, Paul and I, during the course of this presentation. So it's about serendipity, about innovation. I suppose if there is one more theme that we want to bring out during the next few minutes, it's also one about the pace at which the pensions industry moves. And we will contend that it's not moving fast enough at all, which may sound like a really contrary statement, because it feels, if you work in pensions, like everything's happening very quickly. But I'm specifically talking about the industry and not the environment. Clearly, the environment we operate in is moving massively, rapidly, arguably too quickly for us to keep up with. But I'm talking about whether the industry always embraces the change that is available to it. And in fact, I have what I want to do, perhaps, is give you some examples. So here are some statistics that I've just pulled out from various sources that illustrate how fast the world is moving. I'll let you sort of digest them in your own time. But what I'm keen to do is pick out 3 examples of serendipity. And these aren't necessarily pensions examples to start with, but we'll quickly get into the association as far as the pensions industry is concerned. So one example is this, and it picks up on a theme that Professor Winston talked about today. I advise companies and trustees at PwC on a range of issues, and one of my particular clients is a financial services client, a bank, has a defined benefit pension scheme, and they invited me recently to an event where they support and sponsor, as a corporate charity, a charity that is to do with dementias, the Alzheimer's Society. And it was interesting already that a question was asked very serendipitously by that society of the bank, which is to say, dementia sufferers can find it difficult to use credit cards because they can't remember their PINs. So what is a solution to that? You're a bank. You tell us how you fix that solution. And actually, a solution, a not too difficult solution, did emerge through the fortuitous circumstances of having the right people in that conversation. I'll show you what that might look like in a minute. So that was a good example of serendipity. I'll give you another example that hasn't worked so well. And I discovered yesterday I have something in common with Jimmy Wales of Wikipedia, that we both had children of the same ages. He has a 4-year-old and a 1-year-old, and me too. And what I can tell you is that it's not very funny when you wake up on a winter Sunday morning with a 4-year-old and a 1-year-old, and find that you have no heating and no hot water because your boiler has broken overnight. And then you can call out the emergency boiler repairman, and it turns out that he doesn't have the part that you need on him. And you think, well, that's just daft. In this day and age, with all the technology available to us, indeed with 3D printing, why couldn't you improve that? Why couldn't you make that better? It feels like the world, and I'm going to use a word here and explain how I'm using it, the world is in beta. I don't use the word beta in an investment return sense. I use it instead, as it was used yesterday as well, in a technology sense. Beta version of apps, beta versions of programs. The idea of something being constantly under development, constantly under evolution, but still good enough to embrace. And that is a contention of what we'll talk about. Are we as an industry waiting too long for solutions or solutions to be perfect and not actually embracing the solutions that could be there, even if they feel a bit beta in form? So the world is in beta because my boiler can't be immediately fixed on a Sunday morning. And then the final example I'll give you of almost a sort of frustrated use of technology. So I now wear, I got for Christmas one of these activity trackers, and it's brilliant. It's actually the new version. So I can tell you, for example, my heart rate. I won't tell you my heart rate. I could tell you my heart rate, but I won't. I might need to sit down in a minute, actually. But it's, you know, it's amazing. I don't know quite how it does that, but it sort of almost feels unfinished. If it can do that, why can't something that I can wear work out much more about my body, work out any deficiency in my nutrient levels, any shortage of hydration? And if we have the Internet of Things, if everything can be connected to the Internet, then why can't it tell my shopping order that we need to order some more broccoli or cabbage or spinach or whatever it might be, ideally in a smoothie, so I don't notice that I'm eating all that stuff. But why can't we improve through serendipitous or other forms of organization the way we use technology? So these are the themes that we want to return to as we go through the presentation, but particularly that theme of a world being in beta, and really should the pensions industry be in beta, or should we see more of pensions in beta? Let me first though just show you what some of the solutions to the ideas I've just talked about might look like. Take a look at this video.
From the moment we wake to the moment we sleep, our lives are being transformed by technology. The pace of change is extraordinary. And with every innovation, that pace of change increases. Where some see disruption, others see a mobile workforce. The future of commerce. A more connected health service. The world's most secure transaction. The end of complex supply chains. Technology enables you to constantly create new competitive advantage. The world is exploding with potential. The world is in beta.
So the world is in beta, and you'll notice that there weren't any pensions examples in that for now. It's surprisingly tricky to make completing a buyout deal look as cool as any of that. But we are going to dive into the world of pensions straight away and look at this potholed road. And why are we looking at a potholed road? Because really the pensions industry is much like a potholed road, and I wonder if we are repairing it pothole by pothole, which is a very inefficient way of doing things. In fact, if you resurface a road altogether, you can do that 20 times more cheaply than repairing a pothole, repairing it pothole by pothole, and yet government and local councils are throwing money at repairing potholes. It's just not very efficient. And nor is the pensions industry. And you would never, of course, this hasn't been designed like this. No one person in this room or anywhere else sat down decades ago and said, this is the industry I'm going to design. But it is the industry that we have inherited, and the industry that we need to do something about, and it's rife with inefficiencies. We have the problem, the totality of the problem, spread amongst 6,000 separate defined benefit pension schemes. That's just in the private sector, involving over 30,000 individual trustees who are very well-meaning more often than not, but they are also more often than not part-time amateurs. And do they have all the experience that they need to manage what are really now very complex financial entities? We have headlined this session talking about how you solve a £2 trillion problem, and £2 trillion is the value of the UK defined benefit private sector liability book, which is worrying because DB now is inevitably a legacy. It's no longer an active tool by and large for recruiting people, for retaining people. Indeed, I think if you look at the FTSE 100, only 4 companies in the FTSE 100 have any form of DB accrual, and depending on where some consultations that are already out there in the public domain end up during the course of this year, I imagine by the end of that year that number may well have halved. So it's clearly becoming a legacy. It's also not clear that we have an efficient ecosystem to deal with that legacy. In a survey we carried out recently of over 200 pension schemes and their recent actual valuations, 30%, over 30% of them were looking at some ultimate goal of getting rid of that liability off their balance sheet through buyout, maybe buy-in, essentially having a matched portfolio. But the market capacity for that has only been running at £10 billion a year, more or less, order of magnitude. That's not really even going to make a dent in the £2 trillion problem. So this doesn't feel very efficient. But what I want to do is invite Paul, who's kind of our conscious in all of this and has the brilliant vantage point of having a sponsor insight into these sort of things as well as a trustee insight, to give your view. Does it feel efficient, Paul, down on the ground in the scheme?
Well, I mean, in my perspective as a trustee and sitting on a number of boards and being one of the 30,000, it's pretty obvious to me that it's not working. I feel that the buy-in $2 trillion example there just tells you it's not working. And for me, one of the issues, or a number of issues, but one of them is I think there are too many trustees. I think it's actually quite hard if you're chairing a board of 10 people looking at some very complex financial products with some very clever consultants to actually reach a consensus that you're comfortable with. So I think that's one issue. I think the other is that the industry as a whole, in my experience, is still struggling to explain, articulate, and put across a good business case. We're being presented with very big proposals for things like longevity hedges, so you're being asked to make a huge bet at an enormous price. I use the language. So I think there's some inefficiency in the system that the consultants, the advisors, the industry coming to these boards, in my view, are not getting it yet. You know, there's a huge opportunity there, and you're not talking the right language. That would be one of my thoughts.
So where do we go with that? And this is a rather unfortunate juxtaposition of metaphors, because what I'm not suggesting is that we replace every characterful potholed country road with an 8-lane motorway. This is a different metaphor altogether. This is actually about a subject that I'm quite fascinated by and studied at university a bit when I did my maths degree, queuing theory. And you'll probably, if those of you that drive, certainly drive on motorways, will have experienced and suffered the problem of traffic turbulence, essentially, the brake light effect, where one driver can just tap their brakes and on come the lights, and it creates a domino sequence of everybody slowing down, and it creates a traffic jam. Well, how do you solve that problem? It's not that difficult to solve. You can deploy some technology, which many of you may well have in your cars right now, called adaptive cruise control, which is a cruise control that has a radar and can see what traffic and car is ahead of in front of you and automatically slows down. So that's technology that's available now. But it needs to be used by a decent majority, or at least a decent minority, I suppose, a decent share, if not the majority. There's evidence and research that shows that if you have 20% of motorway users using and deploying adaptive cruise control, then many of these short-term traffic turbulence situations you find in where the traffic just seems to grind to a halt for no apparent reason could be eliminated. And in fact, if you have 25% of motorway users using adaptive cruise control, then you can reduce overall aggregate travel times by about a third. So why am I using that example? Because there's three features of it that will be common to the examples we want to give you later on that cover assets, members, and liabilities that are relevant from this. And those three features are that it's a use of technology that allows us to do something, it's deploying data, it's using data, in this case data about the distance of the forward vehicle in front of you, and it's being used by a decent share of the participants in that system. And the analogy, of course, would be something that pension schemes use in decent share. So they are the hallmarks of what we think good solutions look like. And I rephrase them slightly on this slide by way of a blueprint. So technology I've just talked about. Volume efficiency is my kind of paraphrase for the idea of a decent share. I've deliberately not called that consolidation because you might look at the situation of 6,000 defined benefit schemes and maybe look at the example in the Netherlands where they've condensed that to much fewer schemes and say, is that the way to go? I just don't know if that's practically feasible given the legal trust structure and everything else we have in the UK. But there is definitely scope for collaboration, if not consolidation. And I'll come on to the people, not pensions point in a minute, which is to do with data. But Paul, again, any kind of reflections on what good might look like?
I mean, I think, again, I'm sort of repeating some of the same comments from before, but again, in my experience as a trustee and then going to corporates, I think in terms of volume efficiency, it's going to be more likely for boards of trustees and corporates to dip their toe into some of these new de-risking ideas if you're doing it gradually. And I think if you're presented with some huge deals, which may make some sort of sense in terms of, you do it in one go, but a lot of people will be put off by that. It's back to my previous comment, it's still seen as an enormous decision to make. So it's almost this gradual build-up of the good idea, sustainable relationship with the board and your advisor over time. I think you've got more chance of dealing with a £2 trillion problem over 10, 20 years than trying to crack it quickly.
Okay. So, and then the people not pensions point there, and I've already fallen for the trap of this by talking about a £2 trillion problem, because really it's not that. It's a problem for, say, 20 million people that are expecting their pensions to be delivered by the ecosystem that we have. And what I find inefficient, again, and unusual, is that you could have an individual that, say, has 3 different legacy defined benefit pension schemes and 3 different bits of benefit in those pension schemes, but it's been dealt with and has been handled very differently by those 3 different trustee boards, in particular, who may have a very diverse opinion about the role of pensions flexibility, of member options, of the way to allow DB members to access pensions freedom, for example. And does that make sense? I know there are currently some data limitations and some administrative limitations about trying to understand the totality of that individual member's picture, but it surely doesn't make sense from that individual member's viewpoint to be dealt with, to be handled, or what would feel like being handled in 3 different ways by 3 different schemes. There must be a way of aggregating that, and we will show later on an example of how you can use data to enhance the individual member experience. But this is the blueprint that we want to talk about. And just to pick up some case studies, because it's not as if some of this is not happening already in the industry. This is another way of expressing the themes. What I find a brilliant example and a really, really interesting one is one of the local government pension scheme situation where you have 90-odd funds spanning about £180 billion in assets. They're separate funds at the moment. But notwithstanding that there is some central government pressure to create the benefits of collaboration, possibly consolidation, but more likely some form of collaboration, some form of common investment vehicle for the assets. Some of those funds are voluntarily realizing the art of the possible and moving towards doing that. And there are great examples already of combining the scale and the force of those local government funds, not only to create efficiencies in things like investment fees, reducing by a significant number of basis points when you start creating the scale around working together, but also giving them access, and we've heard about this in other sessions already in the conference today, giving them access to new types of opportunity. Again, Manny Norman talked about some very interesting tactical opportunities, investment opportunities yesterday, but they're not easy to access unless you've got scale. So it makes me wonder, well, what's stopping private sector schemes from embracing that kind of behaviour? Why is it that we are, by and large, with some exceptions, and the NAPF's own pensions infrastructure platform is a great exception to show it can be done, but why isn't that happening more? Why aren't pension schemes proactively going forward to exploit the benefits of collaboration? The LGPS I've given you as one example. I'm not going to run through all of these now, but it is interesting that when you have the opportunity to start with a clean sheet of paper, say in the realm of DC and auto-enrollment, you use master trusts, and you immediately see that when you've got the opportunity to start with a clean sheet of paper, that's the way to go. Now, we don't necessarily have the opportunity to overnight rewrite the DB legacy, but why aren't we doing more with that DB legacy? So, having talked about, very briefly, admittedly, about an example in the sphere of assets, I said I wanted to give you an example in the sphere of the individual member experience, and then we'll also talk about liabilities and how you can deal with liabilities. There's no doubt that it's all about the individual now, and individuals are interacting and engaging with decisions which affect them and the data about them in radical new ways. I wanted to show you something that is actually, I don't know, it might appear really profound to you, it might not appear profound at all. We are doing this now, and it definitely sort of when we talk to organisations about it, some are wowed by it, and I suppose some that we've already done it with have got used to it now and treat it as normal. But it's a technique where you can apply data, and in this case, non-pensions data, about individual members to substantially improve the way you interact with them. So, for example, you can now take individual credit rating data and basket people into, say, one of 50 categories to do with their ability to save for the long term. You use information such as how big is their mortgage and do they pay it off in full every month? Are they a frequent and wide user of financial products such as ISAs and premium bonds? To the other end of the scale, where people are unlikely to have a mortgage, they may be not even paying their credit card bill off in full every month, they may have applied for and used and defaulted on a payday loan. You get the idea. I've given you the two extremes, but there's a spectrum there of how you can deal with people. And then you can, or how you can measure and assess their ability to save. And then you can look at in this particular example, their DC pension savings provision and rate them. And I've got a color-coded rating on this slide where red is that they're very far off from reaching the target income that they need to reach in retirement. Amber is that there's likely to be a shortfall. Green is that they've got the chance of being on target. And blue, and there are members in blue, who would comfortably meet the target, or at least the target that they have assessed that they need to live on. So there may be something to explore there. So you can plot these members and start then focusing the way you engage with them in a much more specific way. I won't go through all the black circles, but I'll just ask Paul to comment, because you've sort of done a little bit of this in wearing your company hat on, but I don't know, maybe the bottom right example is an interesting one of members with a high propensity to save, but are stuck on quite low savings rates. In this case, a fair bit of bunching around the auto-enrollment minimums. What's going on there?
I've done some work in the last 2 or 3 years looking at people's attitude to saving. So with the company I work with, SSE, we spent quite a lot of time asking the members their attitudes. So we actually went out and spoke to employees through online surveys. So not just looking at their actual pounds ability to pay, but do they want to save? Do they actually want to save? What's their attitude? And that informed our campaign. And we found that if you engage staff, there is quite a lot of interest, but there is a sort of nervousness about saving. And once you get some simple messages across and go through repeat campaigns, it can make a real difference. So in the last 12, 18 months, we've had something like 1,700 people increase their contributions, either a fairly significant step up or pre-agreed increases every year for 3 years. So we're going through this cycle, and it's constantly replaying some of the themes that came out from the online surveys from the employees. So So there's a bit of segmentation, different views from different people. That informs the way we engage with different age groups, for example, men and women. There's some subtle differences that do make a difference. So it's getting the numbers in terms of what we think they can afford to pay, but really addressing the issue, what's stopping them pay if it's not down to the money. So it's about confidence and trust.
And inevitably, as you go around the chart, and you don't just have to segment it up into quadrants, but there are flip sides to that point. There are people that, on the face of it, would appear to have a low ability to save for their pension scheme at the current point in time, but for whatever reason, maybe saving quite a lot, and maybe they've got lured in by employer matching arrangements or whatever it might be. But you might want to question, well, given the typical returns that they're likely to achieve in a DC pension scheme versus, say, the 18-20% APR they might be paying on their overdue credit card bill, is that quite the right thing for them to be doing? Is there a more overall financial wellness approach to how they handle their personal finances? And by the way, you can exploit this technique of combining a smart analysis of data across a number of other axes and measures. I've just happened to have picked one up there for illustration around ability to save. You can also do it on a spectrum of the ability to take risk, and then start charting that against the investment choices that members have made, or more likely haven't made, have been defaulted into, but start then issuing targeted communications and managing these situations to get both the combination of the right contribution profile and the right risk profile for that individual member. So this is slightly, in the sense that we're talking about DC, it's slightly off subject from the core problem of how you solve the £2 trillion defined benefit legacy, but Paul and I were keen to cover it because I don't think any presentation nowadays would be complete if you're just talking about DB. We arguably, unless we get this stuff right, are facing another problem, which would be a massive problem around adequacy, or more specifically inadequacy, of long-term pension savings. Everybody knows that, and everybody talks about it, and everybody talks about segmentation too, but this was wanting to give you an idea for a way you can practically take those themes and do something with it. But I'm keen, I think the industry has a responsibility as well to anticipate and preempt the adequacy problem. Otherwise, we'll be in this room in 10 years' time, not talking about a £2 trillion problem, but almost talking about the opposite of it. So we've done a sort of quick review of asset ideas, and this is not to give you the exact menu of ideas that will apply to your particular scheme, but it is to give you inspiration and hopefully motivation to go and think, well, what can you do in the situations of your specific pension schemes? We've then had a look at the member perspective. Just wanted to introduce one more example, which is around the liability side. We talked at the start around a £2 trillion problem and the fact that the flow of capital from essentially UK PLC balance sheets just is not fast enough, the pipe is not big enough to transfer that across to insurance company balance sheets. And with DB being a legacy, most DB pension schemes now effectively are just annuity books of business, or maybe deferred annuity books of business. They don't feel like the sort of entities that companies should be running, and I expect, and our survey evidence supports this, they're not even the sort of entities that trustees feel that they should be running, because a good portion of them want to be migrating them off their own responsibility. However, the way that you can do that at the moment is remarkably inefficient, and it is one of those incredible examples of no one would have ever thought to design this method, and yet, at least until recently, this was the method that you had to adopt. So what happened if you're a pension scheme looking to transfer some of your liabilities, and the same principle applies if you're buying in a matching asset to your liabilities? You would have to approach a number of insurers separately, and you might have to pay someone to do that on your behalf. Each of those insurers then has to take information you give them about your benefit structure, about your membership data, which you're having to issue, individual personal membership data, to a number of different parties. Then they are recreating, effectively, an actuarial valuation model. There are some risks in that. Not every single party may interpret the benefits or certain features of the benefits in exactly the same way, so there's usually a bit of toing and froing. This is a simplified version because it shows all the arrows going in one direction, but the reality is there's back and forth against all the arrows. So they're doing that. You're getting 5 versions of your actual valuation model. Then eventually, usually weeks if not months later, but not necessarily all at the same time. They're coming out with prices, and then that obviously feeds into, typically whatever advisory support you need, and however capable you are as an in-house scheme, you'll likely be getting some form of external advice because of the FCA regulation that goes around these sorts of transactions. So that is how it works mostly at the moment, and it does seem to be multiplying the effort and indeed multiplying the time by and multiplying the fees by an unhelpful factor, at least a factor of 5 at least, and in some cases the time and the fees may be proportionately more than that. I mean, Paul, before I go on to the good news, any reflections on that? Not necessarily just with buy-in and buy-out transactions, but any other, I know you talked about the fragmented nature, but any kind of observations on the experience on the ground?
I mean, I think that's probably a common experience of a lot of trustee colleagues out there, that there seems to be a long process in a lot of these initial ideas that we get in principle before you get to the point where you're prepared to do a deal or make a change or increase assets and move them from A to B. And I think for me there's two things. One is it still feels very expensive to do anything significant. If you're trying to convince corporate colleagues as a trustee of doing a de-risking plan, there's a lot of challenge about, well, why is it, what's it cost, what's the payback? It takes a long time, and I think on the trustee side, I think we need to get a bit more nimble and a bit more effective in the ask and articulating what it is we're trying to get, and treat it like any other transaction that we do, which we would look at price, value, and payback. And I think it's a challenge for us all. It's not the advisors, the consultants, the actuaries, the trustees, it's all of us together. I think we need to find a way of, for me, creating smaller choices which make it easier to make a decision and step on to, say, a de-risking plan or hedging longevity. More likely to do it for a couple of $100 million than do it for $3 billion.
So how can you make the notion of accessing deals like that, which you might do more frequently and you might be more inclined to do, how can you make that more accessible? And this is where this next example comes in, an example of a facility called SkyVal Insure. Now, I don't want to spend ages talking about SkyVal, but I need to tell you a minimum amount of things so you understand how the facility works in the context of the insurance transfer of liabilities. So what is SkyVal? And if you really want to know more about this, go and visit the team on the stand downstairs and pick up your free iPhone charger, your free mobile charger and everything else, all the good stuff that's down there. But essentially, SkyVal, in summary, is an actuarial valuation system, so any pension scheme can use it. It does everything. It does all the analytics that you might expect you might need from a pension scheme, the triennial actuarial valuation, the funding updates. It's done all in real time, the asset liability modeling for the company, the accounting disclosures, etc., all of that. It was originally designed to eliminate the inefficiency and the problem of pension schemes and their sponsors drawing on typically multiple advisors, and each of those advisors effectively having to create their own model. It's not dissimilar to what's going on in the insurance context. The scheme actuary has his or her own model to do the triennial valuation. The investment consultant's got to set up an asset liability model. You're paying more than once for the overhead of that to happen, and indeed then paying more than once of the overhead of keeping their systems up to date. So what if you could have, as you can now with SkyVal, one single system that all advisors can just plug into, and it's accurate enough to sign off on numbers on. So that was the vision and the practice, indeed, behind SkyVal. It's already in use for about £200 billion worth of pension schemes. And it helps really reduce costs and speed up the decision-making process and avoid the situation where if you need some new numbers, you need to task someone to go away and create these numbers and then come back weeks later and reconvene your management or trustees to look at them again. This can all happen live in the room there and then. It's sort of industrial scale, very transparent and user-friendly valuation model. So how does that, because this is a bit of serendipity at work, how does that have any relevance to the insurance market? Well, it turns out it has a really good relevance, and in fact a relevance that is of appeal to a lot of the stakeholders in that system, because one of the other problems with the version above I didn't mention is that nobody really likes that. Trustees don't like it because it's too slow. Companies don't like it because they don't get quick enough price transparency. But the insurers don't like it either, because fewer than 30% of the deals that go through quotation ever end up being executed anyway. So it's a really inefficient use of their limited resource, and it makes it very difficult for them to deploy their capital. Is there a better way? Yes, there is, and this was the final example of the set I wanted to give you. You can use the SkyVal engine, if your pension scheme's already set up on it, to do valuations or whatever else you might need to do. And because you can give selective access, conditional access to any third party to SkyVal, the scheme actuary can just see the scheme actuary stuff, and the investment consultant can just see the asset liability modeling, and the corporate can just see the IAS 19. You can carve that up. You can let the insurers access a very small section of SkyVal. They don't need to actually have the member data. It's already in the system. They don't need to interpret or create the benefit structure. It's already in the system. All they need to do privately is put in their pricing assumptions, and out will come an insurance quotation. And you can do that for as many insurers as you need to do. And it happens, that can happen, as you can probably guess now, in days rather than weeks and months. It's literally the actual process of calculating it happens very, very rapidly, but even the human process around it can happen significantly more quickly. And that was the other component of the way I would encourage the industry to think, is around these order of magnitude improvements that we can create. We could talk about condensing, say, an 8-week process above into 8 days, but why not, or even even quicker than that, but why not think much more radically and look for order of improvement magnitudes and take what can be a 3-month process down into 3 days, which is what we've been achieving with SkyVal Insure. So that was one of the final examples. Paul, just any sort of further comments before we go into our, we're then going to as we started outside of pensions, we're going to finish outside of pensions, but before we leave pensions per se, and we can always come back to any detail in the Q&A, any further remarks, Paul?
I suppose, I wrote a note down when I was looking at the slides the other day with Raj, and it sounds like we're moving to the world of virtual actuaries, where we have a calculator and we get some very high-level advice, and hopefully, again, the price comes down. Again, from a trustee perspective, I think the trick with a lot of these tools is how we use it, if we use it, and I think guys like PwC and all the others need to, from my perspective, explain practically how you can use these tools, because you're all coming up with your version of SkyVal. How does it make economic sense for us to use it? So how do we change the relationship with our actuary or investment consultant?
Exactly right, yeah. And that's, to your point about virtual actuaries, and to reassure you, I am here in person. I'm not just a holographic projection. But what you don't want to be doing in a pension scheme is paying at an hourly rate of hundreds of pounds an hour, any team, an actuarial team or otherwise, to be doing number crunching. Yeah. So if you can have a common platform that everybody can use, like SkyVal, that significantly makes the process more efficient. And indeed, it's now having appeal to third parties like the insurers. In fact, all the active insurers in the UK bulk annuity market are signed up to that platform. And it's one of a kind at the moment. So we want to finish on something outside of pensions. We hopefully have given you some inspiration and vision at the start around the art of the possible, the way that serendipity and technology can work if only we embrace them. We then dove into some pensions examples. This is nothing to do with pensions. This is, or not on the face of it, but I thought it had a relevance to this topic. This actually comes from a strategy consulting firm, and it's designed to talk about, in a business context, when you do joint ventures and alliances, the rules for making them effective, or guidance for making strategic partnerships, as it calls them, effective. But it struck me that there is a lot of relevance to how you apply this to the pensions industry. I came across this because of SkyVal, because SkyVal is a joint venture, and it kind of got me thinking, oh, right, have we actually applied, albeit only having seen this later with hindsight, have we applied these rules to the success of SkyVal? And I thought they were really good. So they kind of speak for themselves, but just to go through them. So rule number 1, never innovate alone. I think you do need to realize the pension scheme application is you're unlikely, sitting within the 4 walls of your own individual pension scheme, to by yourself figure out the solution to some of your problems. And of course you deal with external third parties, advisors and perhaps other industry networks, but do you need to ramp up that collaboration in the way that I've been suggesting and talking about? Because usually innovation comes from bringing together different perspectives. Rule number 2 is to understand, and this also applies to decision making as a trustee, it's expressed here in the context of business, but no single entity, no single firm, as it says, can claim to fully understand user preferences. So again, if you're really going to understand your members' desires, how do you do that? Do you feel you've got the intel and the data as a trustee board and you've analysed it in the right way, or as a sponsor to really understand what your membership is after? Because you might be surprised if you analysed it in different ways and looked to other sources of inspiration for that. Rule 3 is focusing on a great user experience. And again, this comes back a little bit to my point about the individual member with 3 different legacy defined benefit schemes, and are we giving that person the overall best user experience that enhances the reputation of the pensions industry. Rule 4, striking the balance between scale and customization. It's curious that in our industry, we seem to have got scale and customization all a bit wonky. We've customized the £2 trillion problem. We haven't designed it, as I said at the start, by it, but we've ended up in a very customized version of it with 6,000 individual defined benefit schemes, where actually scale would have been better. But then on the other hand, we are sometimes dealing with members in a scale kind of way by using generic approaches, whereas actually a customized way would be better. So have we got the balance right between when we make a decision about doing something off the shelf and with scale, and when we're doing something in a much more bespoke fashion? And I think you'll better see the parallels to decisions you make every day in that rule. And then 5, treat your partnership like your business. I mean, this is just a great rule in a world that is increasingly about alliances and joint ventures and working together, to the importance of waking up in the morning and whatever alliance or joint venture you've done, treating it like your own, waking it up as if it's really your problem, and that will sort of help you put the passion and motivation you need to go into it, as hopefully the other party involved will do so as well, to really make it a success. And the most successful alliances and collaborations that we see happen do abide by those 5 rules. So food for thought outside of the pension sphere. Just to finish then before we go into Q&A, Jimmy Wales from Wikipedia yesterday a couple of times showed a picture of his 1-year-old daughter. He claimed it was accidental, but let's face it, it wasn't, because why wouldn't you? If you've got a 1-year-old, you like to sort of be proud of them. I didn't get the memo to say bring pictures of your children, but I have hundreds of them on my iPad. I just don't have them up here. So if you do want to see pictures of my beautiful children, then feel free to ask me afterwards. But instead, I've just updated the statistics from the ones I showed you earlier were from since this morning. And just while we've been speaking, 6 million more purchases have been made online just in the UK, and 6 million roughly tweets have been made, which is a coincidence because there are 6 million people on the web stream. So I wonder what they've been up to, but maybe not paying full attention. Let's re-engage them with a Q&A. Thank you very much.
Raj, thank you.